And she said, "Smell this bucket." Not something you get asked on a regular basis.
No, not at all.
I'll say, "Yeah, I'd be glad to smell that bucket." So, I kind of stuck my head in the bucket a little bit and took a whiff. And I was like, that smells like human decomp just a little bit.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement.
All right. So, welcome to this month's episode of Law and Disorder. I am here today with Doug Scott, who some of you, if you've been listening to Precinct 444 from the very beginning, might recognize Doug. His daughter, Madison, is our director of visitor experience here at the museum. And Doug is retired law enforcement. He was featured on one of our first episodes of our Icons series. He and Madison did an interview that's definitely worth going back and listening to. But now we've brought him back to, rather than talk about his career as a whole and what it was like growing up in a family with a law enforcement officer, we're going to talk about some of the technical aspects of his career today, digging into a case that he worked during his career, to
Digging.
talk about what it's like to investigate a crime scene. So, Doug, welcome to Law and Disorder.
Thank you. I love your choice of words, digging.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, exactly. Digging. Because it does involve, this case does involve some literal digging.
Yes, yes, it did.
But you've made it on two of our four precinct four shows so far. So look at
Yeah,
that.
that's awesome.
Knocking them out. And we love
Well,
having you
thank you.
here.
Well,
So
I appreciate it
um
once again.
of course. So before we really get started,
Mhm.
Doug, why don't you introduce yourself to our Law and Disorder listeners and
Okay,
tell us a
so
little bit about your career in law enforcement.
again, my name is Doug Scott. My career started out with the sheriff's office, Durham County Sheriff's Office, back in the early to mid '80s. And so I worked there primarily as a patrol officer. Initially, I did end up becoming an instructor, certified in state of North Carolina, and so that was my first taste of teaching and instructing. But also very fortunate, had the opportunity to work in a multitude of areas or divisions, if you will, within the department. Flew a couple of times, both in helicopters and fixed winged aircraft with the State Bureau of Investigation. It was pretty cool. Also with the Air National Guard. Um, but the area that I think I fell in love with the most was once I started merging over into the forensic side of things. And ironically, that didn't happen until I really left the sheriff's office full time and took a position with a local college as the coordinator for the criminal justice program. They are a program director for criminal justice. And it was in that role was sort of introduced into forensics. I had an entire lab there I was going to be responsible for, and I needed to know more of what I didn't know. And so then I started going to schools and traveling and picking up information and working with other individuals in the field, and then developing courses myself to offer to local agencies around the state, which then turned into even federal agencies. So, um, along with that came more opportunities to work with these agencies, not just in the instructor and student capacity, but also being called out to assist in processing crime scenes. And these were primarily crime scenes that involved either surface skeletal remains that were typically on the surface or scattered around too, but also buried remains. And so I sort of channeled off in that direction, which worked out really well because I also had the opportunity for a few years to work with he's retired now with Dr. Bass. You probably are familiar with him, Bill Bass from the Body Farm at University of Tennessee. So I gained even more knowledge and more experience in dealing with skeletal material and also the forensic archaeology and anthropology side of things. But anyway, so yeah, law enforcement, patrol, a little bit with the narcotics unit for a while, but mostly instruction, eventually, and then compiling all that together, moving forward in the forensics field, and developing my skills there and honing those skills, and then working with other individuals to continue building those skills to where I am now. So, which is completely retired now, but to where I ended up. So, so
Absolutely.
I had the opportunity to work. Sorry, I'm dragging this out
No, you're good.
with local agencies around the state of North Carolina, presenting workshops around the state. I work with local police and sheriff's offices. I also work with State Bureau of Investigations in North Carolina, with CCBI in Raleigh, Wake County, I should say. I work with NCIS out of Norfolk, Virginia, and out of the Jacksonville area in North Carolina, from down at Camp Lejeune. Also with CID with the Army. So I've worked with some different medical examiners from around the state. So I've had opportunity to be involved with some great people from all walks of law enforcement, and even from the, academia, which was really great because you really got to combine the two of those together and get people working together. So,
Absolutely. And these kinds of cases, like talking about skeletal remains and
mhm.
buried remains and things like that, like they do really have being able to examine those types of remains from a law enforcement standpoint and figure out, the criminal justice side of it,
Mhm.
like how remains end up there, like what happens to these people that causes death, and being able to see the effects that it has in these real life situations, but also looking at it from an academic perspective,
Mhm.
being able to have that kind of collaboration between law enforcement and academia is what
Uh,
helps like
100%.
medicine to get better, helps current law enforcement to get better, and also
Yep.
help those that are going to college and trying to enter the field or even getting professional training after the fact. It makes them more effective at their jobs and their
Yeah.
investigating. So the
I
fact that you kind of had that experience, like being in the middle of that,
mhm.
it's a really big deal as well.
It really is. And it's funny. I that never really hit me until I was in a class many years ago. And one of the things that were brought up in the class was the importance. And this was a doctor in forensic anthropology. In his class I was in, he was the one that brought this up. And it's like, oh, geez, the light bulb went off all of a sudden for me. It's
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, he is so right. I've always looked at it, it's never us against them, but my us against them was it's never the SBI or the police department or the sheriff's department, or ATF, we always worked together just fine, in my opinion, or at least my experience was always that way. But I never really thought about, wait a minute, there's these other entities out there that are not in law enforcement that we should be tapping into and working closely with. Like I say, that collaboration between
Mhm.
the academia and the criminal justice system and law enforcement specifically. Yeah, you got to it takes a team effort. It's not one person. And unfortunately, I will say, and we have seen this. Unfortunately, we saw it, September 11th. Um, we saw a breakdown of communication between agencies where they didn't communicate, couldn't communicate. Intel wasn't passed on, and in the acute situation, the emergency situation, agencies couldn't literally get on the radio and talk to one another. And to me, communication is the key in all of this. Now, obviously, on a more granulated surface, we're talking about just the forensics cases. Um, but yeah, academia, law enforcement, you got to get the two working together. And eh, I think you all are in the same boat up in Washington and Virginia area that we are in North Carolina. I mean, what they say, you can't sling a dead cat without in a college or a university, you know.
Exactly.
Uh, so I would tell the students, hey, if you're collecting soil samples, work with the geology department at the local university or
Mhm.
college and have them to help you understand what you're looking at and how to run analysis. You have these resources available, and most of the time I think they would jump at the opportunity to get involved and to work with a law enforcement agency and you should be massaging that relationship regularly.
Definitely. And communication and just finding outside of the box resources, like, you know,
Yes.
really, especially in today's day and age where it's really easy to just, oh, I can figure out the answer. I can hop on Google or something like that. And it's
Mhm.
like, actually, maybe it might also help you to consult an in person expert. Like,
Thank you.
instead of that person that wrote the article you found on Google, maybe shoot them an email. Like,
Hmm.
they might you could create a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think that the case that we're going to talk about today has a
Hmm.
lot of that communication in it, having to communicate with other agencies, having to work together, because this ended up being a pretty big case. As we were
Yeah.
kind of talking about getting this episode together and looking up kind of to get some background knowledge on the case, because we're
Hmm.
not going to
Hmm.
get into the like criminal justice details of the case necessarily.
Right. Right.
We're going to look at it from a more technical, like feet on the ground in the
Hmm.
field type of perspective. So just one little snapshot from a huge case that you could cover with multiple episodes, right?
Right. Right.
But today we're going to discuss. I'm going to give a little bit of background so
Hmm.
that for
Hmm.
our listeners, they know kind of put what we're going to talk about into context.
Okay.
So the case we're going to discuss today is a double homicide case. The two victims were 28-year-old Antonia McCoy and 4-year-old Jaden Higginbotham. The main suspect in the case, Pete Lucas Moses Jr., was eventually sentenced to 2 life terms for these murders. So he was convicted. There was a conviction
Hmm.
in this case. And in the investigation, it was determined that he had been the leader of an alleged cult in Durham, North Carolina, that McCoy was a member of, as well as Jordan Higginbotham's mother. So, just to give a little context of how all these 3 people came together, McCoy had left her home in DC and joined Moses's following, where Jaden Higginbotham's mother was already a member. They were all living together in a home in Durham, North Carolina, with a
Hmm.
bunch of other people as well. McCoy became very fond of this boy that was living in the house with Moses and all of these other women. But it was pretty apparent early on that Moses was not fond of the boy. And when McCoy's mother reported her, or McCoy's family, sorry,
Hmm.
uh, McCoy's family reported her missing in February of 2011. As she was becoming harder and harder to contact, police in Durham were already investigating the missing persons case for 4-year-old Higginbotham, who had been missing since October of the previous year.
Hmm.
As part of the investigation, it became apparent that both of these individuals that were missing were connected back to Moses, and the investigation kind of spurred on from there.
Right.
Throughout at some point in this investigation, your expertise was called upon, and it brought you to at least one of the scenes where they believed a body had been moved. So tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about how you came to be involved in the case and kind of what that experience was like.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I had already worked some cases with the Durham Police Department in the past, and also worked with them in some academia situations, putting together some workshops and instruction and stuff like that for them. But in this case, because I had a background in the surface recovery and buried body recovery, they had notified me to see if I was available to come out and help search an area where they believe potentially that the body of the young boy may have been buried. Ironically, where we were, you could visually see the house that this group lived in, that Mr. Moses was renting, or they were renting, or owned, or whatever. So we really were not that far away. So just the overall proximity in and of itself, because it's familiar territory for a lot of criminals, that in and of itself is at least a yellow flag, if nothing else. But we did have a disturbance in the soil, and I don't recall at this point how they initially were directed to this general location. I almost believe that somebody had seen something and reported it to the police, maybe during canvassing of the area or something. But so we did go there. I brought some equipment and we set up a grid and we started processing where the soil disturbance was. And while it was obvious to the naked eye, that somebody had disturbed the ground there. It had been dug up and things moved around or whatever. We didn't find any evidence of the body, any remains or any other type of evidence. What was interesting in this case, though, or this particular scene, was the cadaver dogs did hit on the location. And I'm sort of on the fence with cadaver dogs at times. In fact, I was just telling someone just recently about this. I recall one of the ID techs brought a bucket over to me because part of the process is we remove soil from a portion of the grid. We screen it in case there's something that was missed in the collection of the soil. It literally gets screened for any small items of evidence. Could be anything from a cigarette butt to a fingernail. But, she said, "Smell this bucket." Not something you get asked on a regular basis.
No, not at all.
I'll say, "Yeah, I'd be glad to smell that bucket." So, I kind of stuck my head in the bucket a little bit and took a whiff. And I was like, that smells like human decomp just a little bit. I was like, "Okay, it's my imagination. I just want it to be." And she didn't say a word. She just said, "Smell this bucket." And so I did. And she looked at me. I looked at her. I said, "Yeah, I feel like I'm getting just a slightest whiff." And human decomp's a bit different from other animals. But anyway, so then we decided to set up a little experiment. So we had the cadaver dog out. And if I remember correctly, we set up 5 buckets, several feet apart from each other, and then had the dog go to each bucket. And the dog hit on that bucket. And it's like, okay, we don't have anything that will confirm there was a body here. But again, it's another red flag, or a red flag now. The yellow flag's turning red, I should say. But I was like, okay, this is just too weird. We've got the soil disturbance. We've got a bucket that we can smell. The dogs are hitting on the site as well as one of several buckets. And to go back to clarify that, what we did is we put some dirt in that bucket, and then we took dirt from other places and put in the other buckets, and he hit on that bucket. Now, partly it might have been the bucket, it may have been the soil, but anyway, he still went to that. He or she went to that bucket. So we're thinking, okay, maybe our theory was that because this is in close proximity to the actual house where it was determined it's where the homicide took place with the young boy, that he may have been put in a suitcase or some other container, taken out, buried in a very shallow location, which is what we think we found, and then moved later. And that decomp any of the bodily fluids that may have leached out of the container. I think a suitcase is what we were considering, may have still been in the soil, and that's why the dog hit on that site as well as a bucket after they were set up for this little test we ran. So we searched the area. In fact, I remember having a bunch of cadets come out and we did a line grid search, and we didn't find anything else. But that was a site of interest, and of more interest just because of its proximity to the residence where the scene where the murder took place, as well as the hits we got from the cadaver dog and what we saw.
And then eventually there was, like, the body was not found there, but that type of grid search occurred. And were you at the actual scene where they ended up finding the bodies because they were moved again?
Yes, I wasn't there when they were located. So it's my understanding, well, yeah, this is just too weird. You can't make this stuff up, as they say. So to jump ahead just a little bit, the residence where the bodies were found in the backyard was, and I can't tell you for sure if it was the mother or stepmother of the suspect.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, familiar territory, so the the house where the bodies were ultimately located, the way this came to fruition was there was some sort of an issue, whether it was the smell of a body decomposing or an actual plumbing problem in the house. I'm not sure, but for whatever reason, a plumber was called to the residence. Plumber gets there and he's doing his thing, kind of digging around, looking for specific lines, and I guess trying to track down where there might be a problem.
Mm.
And he runs across a plastic bag, trash bag. And as he starts to kind of pull and tug at it a little bit, next thing he's looking at what he believes to be human flesh, and potentially part of a human body, maybe a leg or something. And so I think he just kind of stopped immediately and called 911, and from there it unfolded.
Which is that's a wild day on the job, for
Especially
anybody.
for a plumber.
Plumber,
Yeah, yeah,
this is not what I was called to deal with,
yeah, yeah.
understandable. But, you've mentioned, like, obviously doing field work, you're out and you've noticed the ground looks like it's been disturbed. You're doing this mostly by just good old fashioned detective work, just looking at the ground and saying something about that is not right.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's funny you say that because I didn't mean to cut you off, so
no, no, you're
or
good.
jump ahead, but one thing that I learned early on, in especially buried body situations,
Mm.
is to rely on your eyes. And if you really take the time to look, if the ground has been disturbed, there's going to be clues there. There's going to be, depressions, or there's going to be a change in the soil color and composition. There's going to be vegetation growing or not growing, um, in an area that's sort of unique, or all of a sudden you have all these little tiny saplings popping up where roots have been cut and they're springing up new saplings. And, when somebody dug a grave, for example, um, it amazes me that you can see those differences if you really know what you're looking for. It could be cracking in the soil, where it's got a depression that's dried and the soil cracks. It's not cracked over here. Why is it cracked here? So anyway, yeah, your eyes. There's technology out there, obviously, that helps,
Mhm.
but your eyes can do great things. So
Yeah. And a big question that I guess I would ask, because I think you had mentioned that they tried to use the ground penetrating radar with this case, and I actually wrote down how the ground penetrating radar works so that
okay,
we can tell this to our visitors
I was going to say,
or
well,
to
you
our
can
listeners.
explain it so I'll understand it.
Yes, exactly, right? So I know we have mentioned on the show before, we mentioned ground penetrating radar.
Mhm.
We brought an author on, I believe it was in early 2024, named Lori Suzanne Dell, who had been working with a police department on the East Coast to look for the grave of one of the first fallen officers from their department from way back in like the colonial era. Um,
Mhm.
and his gravestone, over time, his grave had gone missing. They didn't know where it was. And so they were looking for his gravesite and using this ground penetrating radar
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
try and find the evidence of like a gravestone that had been covered or a ground disturbance, something of that nature. So we have mentioned it before, but it's something that's used in crime scenes like this one. So
Mhm.
ground penetrating radar is essentially a non invasive geophysical method that uses radar pulses to create images of the subsurface.
Mhm.
So it works, to get really technical, it works by emitting electromagnetic waves into the ground, and it's analyzing the reflections of those waves to visualize subsurface features. And it's used in construction, archaeology,
Mhm.
environmental
Mhm.
studies, like all kinds of different uses. And it's kind of like using a metal detector,
Mhm.
but it's just looking at more than just metal in the ground.
Right, right.
Is what that ground penetrating radar does. And it can be very useful. There are police departments around the country that are using it to,
Absolutely. Yep.
and they're using it successfully, but in this case it wasn't successful. And there's a lot of different areas of forensics that have all of these technologies that we're thinking we're going to save so much time, it's going to
Mhm.
be so convenient, But sometimes for cases where we think it should be pretty obvious that it works, it doesn't work. So I guess I should ask you, as somebody who's worked in kind of this area of forensics and things like that, or what would be your advice for people that are going into law enforcement, going into forensics, about that reliance on technology? Do you think that the kind of different areas of technology that we have in
Well,
forensic science
uh,
now are a good tool, or should we still be emphasizing that good old fashioned detective work?
both. And I think you actually alluded to this earlier when you made a comment that, and instead of just reading an article that was generated by AI or whatever on Google, reach out to the person who wrote the article and pick their brain. So the technology is here. Obviously, it's not going anywhere, and it's a great thing. But also, as you said, you also got to rely on just the human element, which again goes back to communications, talking to people and all. But yeah, the GPR is it's a great tool, and I think it's been shown to be very effective in so many different cases. But like any technology, especially where there's interpretation involved. So the operator has to interpret what they are being presented with. That I think is the chink in the armor, as they say. That if they misinterpret for whatever reason, it could be just a bias of their own.
Mm.
It could be lack of training potentially by the operator. It could be laziness. Well, that's make excuses or rationalize what something is, and I say that because I don't know what variable played the role here. But it all boiled down to the to me to being just the proper interpretation wasn't there, I guess I should say. um, so going back to that scene, so we had the adult female, that we had her body that was not in question at that point. It had been located, and we went through the whole excavation process, very tedious, time consuming aspects of unearthing a body and any evidence that's with that body. Um, but we also knew we had a second victim somewhere. And the assumption on our part was probably that the little boy was probably going to be buried on the same property. It just kind of made sense.
Mhm.
If you think logistically, it'd be easier to transport both bodies instead of one here and then going somewhere else, digging another hole somewhere else, and being seen in the familiarity of it being his mom's house, and feeling comfortable there and in the neighborhood. So anyway, ground penetrating radar was used at that scene, to look in the yard and other adjacent areas of where the adult female's body was located, and it did show a disturbance. And so I'm gonna stop there. I wanted to say something you mentioned earlier too. It takes ground, or the earth, if you will, approximately 20 years to recompact and settle back to its compaction, its original compaction. Now, obviously, if there's something there that is there and the ground's going to compact around it and above it, it's not going to completely flatten back out or whatever. But geologically, it takes about 20 years. So if you dig a hole in your backyard, and you probably have noticed, you fill it back in, you step on it, it's kind of soft, the dirt's aerated, it's not compacted anymore. You never have enough dirt to fill the hole back in.
Mhm.
You always need more dirt. And part of that's because you've broken it up, you've aerated, and it would take that hole, even if it were to sink some, that's fine, but it would take that hole about 20 years to get to the same compaction that the ground around it is. So it takes a while. But now you throw a body or something that's buried, so you get compaction all around it, but you also have something compacted within it as well.
Mhm.
So anyway, just throwing that out. So 20 years. But so the GPR, going back to the use of the technology, GPR, is picking up that compaction, and it's looking for anomalies, if you will, in that compaction that indicate there has been a disturbance, as you had mentioned. um, and not just disturbances, but things that may be compacted within that soil, something that's been there for 100 years. In the case of looking for the body of the historical gravesite they're looking for the slain officer. So it does take many years, but so you not only get a disturbance, you also get items that may be naturally compacted in that soil. Well, in this case, we're looking for a body. We knew it wasn't that old. It's not been 20 years. And so we're looking for disturbances in the soil. And the operator did find a disturbance in the soil. And you could physically, going back to using your eyes, you could see on the surface there had been a disturbance in the soil in this area. GPR was run over that area, around that area, and it noted a disturbance in the soil, and it noted there was something there. The interpretation was the issue.
Mhm.
And in this case, the explanation or rationale that we received at the law enforcement side, from this case, the academia side, it was running the technology GPR, was that this was probably where the bad guy started to dig to bury the lady, ran into a large root from this large oak tree next to the grave that we did have, and probably stopped, moved over several feet, and then dug a hole and buried the lady here. The part that sort of broke my heart about that was we were looking for two people.
Yeah.
And we knew we had one. So, the very good possibility the second one, the smaller, the child, was buried there. And again, going back to the statement you made about good old gut feeling and detective work, whatever, we felt like, yeah, that we know what the GPR, the information from GPR was interpreted as and explained to us, but we didn't buy it. And so the next day, because the scene was still secured, we went back out to the scene and went to that exact spot where there was a disturbance that was obvious to the naked eye, and there was a disturbance that was obvious to the GPR. And we lightly probed that area, and then we excavated that area, and we discovered the body of the young boy right where we felt like that's where it was going to be.
Yeah, it does come down to like, and you're not the first officer to say like, we just had a gut feeling.
Yep. Yep.
Because human nature is like, especially when you're kind of put in the place you're investigating this crime, just like if you're at your own house and thinking like, where would somebody logically put this
Right.
based on all these different circumstances.
Hmm.
And sometimes it just comes down to thinking, where logically would this be, and based on what I already know. And
Hmm.
for the families and for the victims, it was lucky that you fit that you acted on that instinct.
Exactly. Yep.
But it is one of those things where it's just sometimes you have to take a risk and you have to say, based on my experience, this is where I think it is, and
Yeah.
sometimes that pays off.
And in this case, look at risk and reward.
Mhm.
There was really no risk at
No.
excavating 6 inches down in the soil or even a foot down in the soil. I mean, I've been to sites where 6 feet low. The soil in Durham, we use always joke that is only a week from becoming rock. It is so hard.
Very
So
hard.
yeah, it is gut feeling, and you're really not risking anything by checking. And at the end of the day, that's our job, is to be curious, to be inquisitive, and to use all the tools we have, whether it's technology or training and experience or our gut feelings. Use what you need to use to get the job done. And in this case, it was just it didn't stop us from ending or getting the ending result we wanted. Because we did. We found the second victim. Um, but it could easily have been a scenario where maybe we didn't have the first body. We just had information that maybe somebody was buried, that the kid was buried there. And we may have never found, if he had not buried the lady there, we'd have never found the kid, I don't believe, because we'd have never gone back and looked. We may or may not have used GPR there anyway, But if we had, then the rationale or the interpretation of the information was that's probably just where they started to dig and it was a root and they didn't finish it.
Mhm.
Okay, let's move on. And then we'd have never gotten a search warrant probably after that to go back and had the opportunity. And I think it was actually a rental property on top of that, which
Yeah.
is another whole problem because then you might have had a new tenant and say just getting some logistical issues. But yeah, we may have missed it completely.
All of these skills that all these kind of observation skills are built on the job, built over years of experience. Like you don't just go to your first scene on day one and say like that happened and I can tell you why. Like there's a way to get there. But what advice would you give either students that are looking to go into criminal investigation,
Mhm.
crime scene investigation, or even officers that are out in the field now that may be like wanting to brush up on their skills? Like what what advice would you give to those individuals to help them kind of get out of that reliance on technology and learn to trust their gut?
Yeah. Well, I think the gut feeling, if you will, or that intuition, which is oftentimes right about many things in life, not just in the criminal justice field, but that's something that you develop. You can't learn it in a classroom. You can't learn it by going to one scene or shadowing one officer in one case or something. It just comes over time. But at the same time, continuing to seek out training and education, um, it's I can't emphasize how important it is because that's how it worked for me, and I know I'm not by myself on this. It's experience and it's training and it's communication and talking things out and brainstorming and not staying in that little silo, if you will. And it's
Mhm.
getting academia involved. It's getting the field workers, the law enforcement officers involved, and working together. So for somebody who's just starting out, you know, obviously they already have an idea. They're interested in targeting or doing that kind of work. That's really sort of the first step. It's a big step and it's an important step, but it's once you get in, it's just you got to be a sponge and you've got to just soak up everything you can get and think outside that box and talk to others and listen to what they have to say and gain knowledge from their experience and develop your own skill set as you go. And for the officers that are already in the field, it's not becoming complacent. It's not don't ever stop questioning and wondering, well, why is this? And don't make the evidence fit the crime. Let the evidence lead you to the crime. The way you don't let that happen is you don't go in with a preconceived idea. I mean, and that's sort of a fine line to walk too, because you're human and you're gonna get
Mm.
some idea of what you think may have happened, but don't hang your hat on that and say this
Yeah.
is exactly what happened. So this could have happened, but be open to these other suggestions that the evidence may lead you to. So,
Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
well, thank you for having me.
Knocking off a second Precinct 444 show. And I'm sure we will have you back here on Law and Disorder sometime in the future.
I hope
Uh,
so. Hope so.
with your forensic expertise. We love to talk about forensic science on this show. If any of our listeners are interested in hearing more about Doug and his career, we have featured him, as I mentioned previously, in our Icons show. He was in an interview with his daughter Madison that released back in, I believe the date was January 4th of 2023, and the episode
Mm,
is titled "Icons: Doug Scott Family Life Behind the Badge." So definitely go back into our catalog of episodes and check that episode out. It's a really good interview, and we're always happy to have Doug on the show.
thank you, Anna.
Of course. And for our listeners, we hope that you really learned something from this episode and enjoyed it. And once again, stay safe, and we hope to see you soon at the precinct.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.